You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Dailey and Kevin Laramée.
Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One, and welcome to your Tuesday. You know what comes after Tuesday, don't you? Yep, Wednesday, and once we hit Wednesday, it's all downhill into the weekend. Mark Dailey here, welcoming you on board for this week's show. And, well, the first Formula One tripleheader in history is now history. Mr. Kerry giveth and he taketh away. We have a week off now between the British Grand Prix and the German Grand Prix, which goes from the 20th to the 22nd. And then after that, the Hungarian Grand Prix, which rounds out the first dozen races of the season. And then we'll head into the summer break at the beginning of August. And then we're literally into the home stretch. Of course, after the summer break, there's still 9 Grand Prix to go, starting with the Belgian Grand Prix and Monza, which are two of my favorite races out of the entire season. But we're there. We're 50% of the way there almost. And it's incredible to believe that we're already literally halfway through the season as we speak. Doesn't seem like that long ago since we were just watching the lights go green in Australia at Melbourne a couple of months ago. But that's part of the fun of Formula One. And if it's like anything it was this past weekend, then hopefully we're going to be in for a treat. Of course, we have seen all the drivers from the top 3 teams winning this season. Well, maybe not poor Valtteri Bottas. It seems to be having all sorts of bad luck when it comes to all the other guys in the top, well, especially in the top 2 teams. I think Danny Ricciardo and Max Verstappen, who have both won some races this year, have had their fair share of bad luck and incidents, but definitely out of the top 4 drivers, I think that poor old Valtteri Bottas must be shaking his head and scratching his head as well to figure out what he has to do to win a Grand Prix. He was looking good there for a little while at the end of the race. What after that first safety car incident, and when they pitted Sebastian Vettel, dropped him down to second. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But my goodness, what a race that was. But it just wasn't the race. Even the qualifying was fantastic. I really enjoyed watching that. And then Lewis Hamilton just saying that he was shaking with emotion after he secured the pole at Silverstone this past weekend. And the top 3 cars, Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel, Kimi Räikkönen, all within a tenth of a second. And I think between Lewis Hamilton and Vettel was about 4.5 hundredths of a second between the two of them. Fantastic stuff. I'd love to see it that close. Bottas a little bit further behind, and then the 2 Red Bulls on row 3. Well, they were the best of the rest, and definitely were not any match for pace. I think even Christian Horner, team principal from Red Bull Racing, said that they were blown away, or words to that effect, by the amount of speed and power that Ferrari had. I believe that the Scuderia made some updates again for this race in Great Britain this past weekend, and they had plenty of pace. But well, it looked like at one point it was going to be sort of touch and go. There were lots of stories going on and off the track. One of them earlier in the weekend was, of course, Sebastian Vettel was dealing with a neck problem. Thought that he might not be able to compete in qualifying, but he was able to do so. And he was saying that even after the race on Sunday, he was having some issues with the neck, but never thought that they would keep him out of the race. Said it might be a little bit sore afterwards, but that's just one of those things. Who said that Formula One wasn't a contact sport? Well, I guess it is. If Romain Grosjean and Carlos Sainz were asked that question. But again, that's a little bit story we will get to a little bit later on. But the big contact of the afternoon happened on the first lap, turn 3. Lewis Hamilton and Kimi Räikkönen came together after Hamilton had a poor start after qualifying so well to get the pole position in Britain, which I think he said was one of the hardest laps he ever drove in his entire career. And Lewis, he's an honest guy. I believe that when he says things like that, I honestly believe that he's telling us the truth. And if he says that's one of the hardest laps that he had to drove, and he really had to dig deep to find something special to put his Mercedes W09 on the pole at Silverstone, that's exactly what happened. But it wasn't easy. I mean, he really had to fight for it. And I think he was really, really looking forward to getting out there and leading that race and winning it, which would have been his 6th British Grand Prix, which has really been a love-in for Lewis Hamilton over the past couple of years. I know after last year, after he won the race, I think one of the comments Lewis made from the podium was something to the effect, pointed the people down just near the podium, said, "You people down there, I'm kind of coming down there in a minute to do some crowd surfing." So you can tell that Lewis loves racing at Silverstone. He loves it even more when he wins, because I mean, it is a very pro Lewis Hamilton crowd. And of course, why wouldn't it be? He is the number one guy, one of the best racing drivers of all time in Formula One, of course. And he loves to celebrate with his fans, with the British fans at Silverstone. So that just didn't happen because, of course, this past weekend into turn 3, after getting that poor start, he was passed by Sebastian Vettel, passed by his teammate Valtteri Bottas, dropped back to 3rd. Kimi Räikkönen got a little bit stuck behind him, wasn't able to go one way or another, got a little bit caught out, wasn't able to get around Hamilton, or at least by the time he realized how slow Hamilton was, Vettel was already past him. Bottas was coming up the inside of Kimi Räikkönen, and Räikkönen got stuck in 4th position and was really pushing Lewis through those first couple of corners. But when they got to turn 3, Lewis went a little bit deep, left the door open, and Kimi Räikkönen stuck his nose in, and very much like Sebastian Vettel and Valtteri Bottas in France at Paul Ricard a couple of weeks ago, locked up his wheel, hit Lewis Hamilton's right rear tire with his left front tire, punted poor Lewis off of the track, dropped him right down to the very back of the race order, and Lewis had a very, very difficult job from there to get back into contention for this race. And Kimi Räikkönen handed a 10-second penalty for his transgression there, knocking Lewis off the track. But there were so many things that were said after the race. One of the things that came out was Kimi Räikkönen's wife suggested that Lewis Hamilton would be better taking up ballet. Meantime, Räikkönen took a swipe at Lewis Hamilton after the race, saying that she doesn't like people who cry like a girl when they lose. And, well, that's, fair enough if you have a complaint about somebody like that, but that's not a cool thing to say. Come on, I mean, to suggest that just because somebody's upset that they cry like a girl if they lose, and, that's a bit of a mean comment. What does that have to do with anything? I don't like that. I think it's a very off-base thing. Who cares if, I don't think it matters that she's a woman making a comment about girls crying and stuff like that. I just think it's an off-base comment. Don't like it at all. Lewis, of course, after the race, he was pretty upset when he was interviewed by Martin Brundle, the Sky Sports color commentator. He made a quote about interesting tactics by the other guys or something to that effect, and just kind of left it at that. It was interesting, too, when Lewis climbed out of the cockpit. I thought that he was really mad. I thought he was really upset after all of that because he didn't stick around in Parc Fermé. He disappeared. He went up into the little holding room that they have just outside of the podium, kind of stuck to himself. Sebastian Vettel went up, kind of shook hands, kind of briefly acknowledged them and said a couple of words. Couldn't really pick up what they said on the TV at the time. Didn't acknowledge Kimi Räikkönen at all. So I thought that Lewis was pretty PO'd, to be quite honest. But afterwards, Hamilton said that he was struggling to stand and he was physically exhausted, and that the cars nowadays are so much more physically demanding than they were just a couple of years ago. And that was one of the things that they said when this current package, these current cars were launched at the beginning of the 2017 season. And I believe things when Lewis, when he says things like that, and he went all the way from the back of the grid to finish second. Of course, he was helped by those 2 safety car periods at the end of the race, but still, even if he finished in, say, the top 4 or the top 5, still a fantastic result. Now, obviously, both the Ferraris had a lot of pace, so did both the Mercedes cars, and it was a little bit too bad that he did have that coming together with Räikkönen at that front corner, or that third corner, but it really did make for some exciting racing and exciting moments to watch, because Lewis is one of those guys, when he's determined, he just gives it his all, and he just completely flies. And you could tell just being at his home Grand Prix, he was extra motivated to really, really make it count and climb his way back into contention. Although he was saying right at the very beginning, in the immediate aftermath of that accident with Kimi Räikkönen, he thought that he had some problems with his car, but his engineer very wisely just saying, hey, the numbers look good. We don't see any problems, just keep going. We can still make something out of it. There's still points to be had. And I was kind of thinking, well, it'll be interesting to see, because we saw a couple of weeks ago when Sebastian Vettel collided with Bottas in France. Both of them ended up at the back of the race order. Vettel ended up, I think, second from back, and Bottas was dead last, and he struggled more because his floor was damaged in that instance. But Vettel, just like Hamilton, really clawed his way up through the race order. But when he got up to fifth position, once he got around the Red Bulls, then that was really about it. When the three cars in front of him, the two Mercedes, not the two Mercedes, but when he got behind his teammate Kimi Räikkönen, then that gap stayed at about 17 or 18 seconds, and they were almost lapping identical times. And Lewis Hamilton was just that much faster, and it was just too much of a gap for Sebastian Vettel. But at Silverstone, Lewis didn't really have those problems. It was kind of interesting just to see how everything was sort of shaking out through with the different pit stops and the different strategies, and where everybody would kind of end up. But Lewis, good to see. Very, very exciting stuff. But just the going on more about the comments that he made. Vettel said it was silly to suggest that Kimi Räikkönen had targeted Lewis on purpose, and he just kind of brushed it off, kind of shrugged his shoulders, and he said, yeah, well, these things happen, and it's silly to say that it was deliberate. And he said he couldn't believe that you could be that precise in order to take somebody else out. And then he referred to the incident that he had in France when he collided with Bottas, and he said, when it happened to me, I basically screwed my own race after losing my front wing, and of course, well, that was it. And of course, not only did he screw himself, but also Valtteri Bottas, and just like his teammate Kimi Räikkönen this past weekend at Silverstone, Vettel got a stop and go penalty, 5 seconds for that incident. This past weekend, I think that's partly, or at least this is my guess, from the fact that after the French Grand Prix, the Mercedes brass, notably Niki Lauda and Toto Wolff, very critical about the stewards at that point, or that race, giving Seb only 5 seconds for that collision that he caused with Valtteri Bottas, and said that it should have been more, and 10 seconds for Kimi Räikkönen. I think that was fair. Obviously, that extra 5 seconds that was tacked on, I think was a reflection of that. But if you look, I believe that the time for a pit stop at Silverstone is about 19 seconds that it's going to cost you, and that's going into the pits, standing stationary, and then leaving the pits to get back onto the racetrack, get back up to racing speed. So if you add on 5 seconds, there's 24. If you add on another 5, there you are at 29. That's a substantial amount of time, and you would really need some special, or to find something special to make up that amount of time. Even Nico Rosberg, Lewis's former teammate and 2016 world champion, said that the crash was 100% not on purpose on the behalf of Kimi Räikkönen, and he basically dismissed the idea that Kimi hit Lewis on purpose. And I think that was I think that was a fair comment as well. But after the race, Lewis, like I said, he said that he made some reference to interesting tactics by Ferrari. Toto Wolff, he went on to question what Ferrari was doing, making something quotes to the effect it's either incompetence or it's deliberate. And then Ferrari was, and quite rightfully so, Ferrari was upset, and they said that Mercedes and Wolff should be ashamed. Those are the exact words that Ferrari used. They should be ashamed for making such accusations. And then the only time where they shouldn't be ashamed of making some accusations is when Sebastian Vettel deliberately crashed his car into Lewis Hamilton at the 2017 Azerbaijan Grand Prix after that safety car incident, or actually during the safety car incident, when he had that weird moment in his mind when he figured that Lewis was brake testing him, and then pulled up alongside him and then deliberately steered his car into the side of Lewis Hamilton. And obviously that kicked off a huge controversy, and what I actually think was a real turning point in that season. I think that Vettel really lost it. He saw red, quite literally, at that moment. But at that point, I think that they were fair. Obviously, they were correct in saying that they were deliberate, or Ferrari was being deliberate, and especially Sebastian Vettel, in causing a collision, which he paid for. Anyhow, just talking a little bit more about that, but just getting back to the start itself, it's all fair that they should be, or making these comments that they think that Ferrari's deliberately making these collisions with their guys. But very much like at France, Hamilton, just like his teammate a couple of weeks ago, left the door open, went a little bit wide, left the door open, and almost invited both of the Ferraris to try and dive up the inside. And I know it is literally a game of inches. I know you're responsible for your car, and I know that the race isn't won on the first lap. It's not won in the first couple of corners. But these guys, this is what they do. If they see an opening on the track, they will most times try to get their way around. And both of these instances, both the Ferraris came off worse for wear. And they were just fortunate, I think, this time that Räikkönen and Lewis Hamilton did not damage their car, and they went on to, to finish the race. And that's just racing. That's just racing in my opinion. But the other thing that I think is interesting, I think it's maybe it's a situation that Mercedes is not really used to. I mean, we've seen over the past couple of years, obviously 2014, 2015, 2016, pretty much a Mercedes dominance. How many races did they win over those years? How many 1-2s did they have? How many podium front row lockouts did they have during qualifying? It was in those years especially, it was Hamilton and Rosberg just going back and forth. Last year, not quite so much. I mean, obviously, at least through the first half of the season, Ferrari and Sebastian Vettel were pushing, but this year it's much more wide open. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about the drivers' standings and about the Constructors' Championship as well. But this year, completely a different scenario than what we've seen over the past couple of years. And honestly, and not to take anything away from Mercedes, but when they've been beaten over the past couple of years in the turbo hybrid area, they've completely gotten it wrong, and they just have not had the pace. And you've watched Ferrari or whoever get out in front and beat them fair and square. But this past weekend, they were very evenly matched again. They both had a lot of power. It looked like Ferrari, especially at the beginning when Vettel went out, pulled ahead. He had the faster car, did end up having some blistering issues on his left front tire when he went in for his pit stop. So who knows? Maybe Seb cooked it, pushed it a little bit too hard in that first stint. But you could tell, even though his lap times were slowing down when you compared him to not just, Bottas was kind of hanging back in second place by a couple of seconds. But you could just compare, say, Sebastian Vettel at the front compared to Lewis Hamilton, who was carving his way through the field, was I think at some points was about a second and a half lap faster than Sebastian Vettel, right up to the point of that first pit stop. So perhaps Seb took a little bit too much out of his tires early on that stint, but in the end, it didn't really cost him too much time. He went into the pits and still came back out in the lead. So it kind of stayed that way until pretty close until the end of the race. But at least after though that safety car period really sort of shuffled things up, and both of them did. Both those safety cars kind of really threw a double wrench into the works. And when you had the Ferraris really mixing up with the Mercedes guys, I just don't know if they're really used to really mucking it up and fighting it out with guys that closely. But it was, for me, quite exciting to watch. So I don't think that it was really fair for them to really point the finger at Ferrari. Obviously, you should be upset about the collision, like I say. But even Hamilton, the one thing I love about Lewis sometimes, I think he says and does stuff that is maybe questionable, but definitely I think displays that passion, that desire that he has. And you don't become a quadruple world champion by being a pushover. You have to constantly push yourself, push your team, and push the equipment that you have. I mean, skill just on its own is not going to get it done for you. I mean, Lewis, obviously one of the fastest drivers well, I think obviously in this current generation, and who knows, maybe one of the fastest drivers of all time. I mean, obviously, I think in the current group of drivers, I don't think over the course of one lap that there's anybody quicker than Lewis Hamilton. I think he's proven it time and time again. But he was the bigger man by the time it was all said and done. Obviously, after the race, he was upset, he was tired, he was probably frustrated to see another potential race victory slip through his fingers through something that was a racing incident. And Räikkönen obviously rightly punished for it, but he did say in the aftermath on Monday, he did take to Instagram to say, Kimi said, "I'm sorry and I accept it and we move on. It was a racing incident and nothing more. Sometimes we say dumb S blank 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 and we learn from it." So there you go. I think Lewis being the bigger man at the end of the day. And come on, I mean, this is Lewis Hamilton. He's the best driver in the best team, in arguably the best car in Formula One. We've got 2 more races here before the summer break, and going to Germany in 2 weeks, that's going to be Mercedes home Grand Prix. Why wouldn't you favor Lewis Hamilton to come out flying? And after that disappointing double DNF in Austria, after that dominating weekend in France the week before, these past 2 races in Austria and Great Britain haven't quite gone Mercedes and Hamilton's way, and now he's trailing Sebastian Vettel in the Drivers' Championship. You know that Lewis is going to want to make that right. He wants to get on a bit of a roll, and I think for him, getting a good result, at least one victory at either Germany at Hockenheim or at the Hungaroring in Hungary in 2 weeks' time, 2 weeks' time will be the way that Lewis can build some momentum and really mount or really make a solid start to a run at a 5th World Championship. Of course, there'll be 9 races to run after the summer break, but Lewis, I think, could really start getting on a roll by getting some good results between now and then. But just talking about those 2 safety car periods that was kicked off about 12 to 15 laps from the end of the race. First of all, we had Marcus Ericsson in the Sauber spinning off by his own mistake, something to do with the DRS going into that first turn. Just lost it. Lost the back of the car, spun off, went off the track through the gravel, crashed into the tires, which was a double DNF for Sauber, which was very disappointing. Charles Leclerc, again, doing a wonderful job finishing in the top 10 for qualifying, and just disappointing that it was an improperly fitted tire to Charles Leclerc's Sauber that cost him his Grand Prix. He was running quite well, qualified 9th to start this one, and I mean this guy has been a revelation this year. And I know just talking to a lot of you on Twitter and just discussing who's been one of the best surprises of 2019, almost unanimously, most of the people that I talk to nowadays say that Charles Leclerc has been wonderful and that are hoping that he will be in driving for Ferrari next year. I mean, Kimi Räikkönen out of contract at the end of this year, 39 years old. Maybe, I think that Bottas does a very good job as Hamilton's number 2, the number 2 at Mercedes. He pushes when he needs to. He can lead races. He can win races. He can qualify well. He can push the Ferraris. And Räikkönen, not quite so good. If Hamilton and Bottas are 1 and 2, and Bottas is the number 2 to that 1-2 punch, I think that Ferrari has a 1, maybe 1.5 punch. It's not quite 1-2 with Räikkönen, because sometimes he'll get stuck behind a guy, and he'll maybe one of the Red Bulls or something, and he just seems that for whatever reason he's just not able or unwilling or incapable of just punching through that 1 to 2 second gap. I know sometimes it's difficult because of the aero effect to pass these cars, but we've seen other drivers do it. But Räikkönen, sometimes I just don't think he's daring enough and just does not really do what it takes to, on a more consistent basis, that is, to apply pressure to the Mercedes drivers and really help his teammate out, or maybe get in front of one of them and maybe back him into somebody else, make their life difficult by having another driver trying to back into them. And Charles Leclerc, I know he's young, 20 years old. Know that Ferrari typically in their history has never given chances to young drivers like that. But I mean, he's this guy's doing a wonderful job in a Sauber of all cars. And you look at where his teammate Marcus Ericsson is, not really scoring that many points, not really qualifying as good as Charles Leclerc is. And I mean, he's constantly getting into Q3 and racing very well in his obviously one of the, I would say, the slowest car on the grid, but obviously it is not one of the best. It is definitely in the bottom, I'd say, a couple of teams, obviously speed-wise. But Charles Leclerc making a solid shout that he should be driving something other than a Sauber for 2019. Anyway, so that his teammate Ericsson is the one that kicked off the first safety car period, and then after that 3 laps after they pulled his car out of the tires, got the field back up and running, Romain Grosjean, Carlos Sainz tangle in almost the exact same position. Both of them end up in a heap in the gravel trap. Safety car comes back out. And of course, the cars that had gone in previously under the first safety car, which was both Ferraris and the Red Bulls, to change from those harder compound tires, the mediums, back onto the soft compounds for what was going to be about a 15 lap sprint to the end, left the 2 Mercedes cars on the harder compound tires. And you could tell that there was doubt in Lewis Hamilton's mind, because after we've seen some questionable tactics that really cost them in the past couple of races, sorry, not the past couple of races, but in Austria, that Lewis was really disappointed about that. And I know, obviously, before that race was over, he retired just like his teammate Valtteri Bottas did. Lewis had that fuel pressure problem, I believe it was, which ultimately ended his afternoon at the Red Bull Ring. But you could tell he was questioning things over the radio, and what with the other cars going in, and Vettel was leading at that point, but Ferrari gave up that position to Bottas in the lead, which meant that Vettel came back out in P2, but having the softer tires. And I think really at that point it was going to be a real question of who's got it right. The harder compound tires in the mediums that the 2 Mercedes had should have been able to go the rest of the way, but were those soft tires that the Red Bulls and the Ferrari switched to, were they going to last long enough and be grippy enough, or was there a danger that perhaps that they could take too much out of those tires before the end of the race? Ultimately, I think it was Red Bull and Ferrari that got it right. Of course, maybe Max Verstappen didn't really get a chance to put that to the test. Obviously, he had some mechanical issues that forced him out of the race at the end there, but it was the 2 Ferraris. You could tell, especially after that second restart, Valtteri Bottas was just really struggling for grip. And it took a couple of tries, took a couple of laps before Lewis was able to, or sorry, not Lewis, but Sebastian was able to get around him. Lewis Hamilton was able to pass him as well. And then Räikkönen as well to, at the end, steal that P3 away from his countryman. But Vettel really had to make a couple of goes to it. And it was really interesting. If you read some of the quotes that came out after the race, just basically the two things, the two diverging opinions or comments for both of those drivers. Bottas said there was nothing he could do to stop Vettel passing him, whereas Vettel said, I gave it everything to pass Valtteri Bottas for the win. So really, really interesting stuff. And it was exciting. It was good to see them. You could tell that Bottas was probably trying to be a little bit more conservative, just trying to stay out in front, not make any mistakes, and just maybe really make Vettel work for it, which he actually had to do. But you could tell that he was really struggling for grip. So I think that if Ferrari and Red Bull got it right with those tire strategies, those spur of the moment tire changes at the end of the race to go back onto the softer compound tires were correct, at least when it came to the Mercedes cars, that Hamilton's tires seemed to fare a little bit better than Bottas, as he still had plenty of pace, was able to keep pace with the 2 Ferraris. But after it was all said and done, Bottas just really could not really keep in contention there. So Kimi Räikkönen getting that P3 from him at the end, but it was obviously very good stuff. But Toto Wolff, the team principal at Mercedes, he did defend the decision, even though like I was saying, that Lewis was questioning his engineer. The engineer was coming back, the tire wear, tire deg, everything, pressures, everything's looking good on the tires. The numbers look good. I thought it was really good. I thought it was really kind of insightful that you had Lewis questioning things. Obviously, that's still playing in his mind, but just the engineer reassuring him, just giving him that information, hopefully that little bit of confidence, because maybe that trust needs to be rebuilt a little bit. I mean, I don't think that Lewis is inferring that his team is incompetent by any stretch of the means, but I think that obviously he wants to make sure that he has the best opportunity to win. So I think, at least from like I say, Lewis's point of view, everything worked out pretty good. So just talking about the Red Bulls now, obviously poor old Max Verstappen, things didn't really turn out too well for him at the end of that race. But of course, when you look at just the entire weekend as it was, that they were down quite a ways, and compared to the other two teams. And you might expect that at a power circuit like Silverstone, that the Red Bull and that Renault power unit are going to really struggle. And Max at least reckoned that Red Bull was missing something in the neighborhood of 70 to 80 horsepower, which is just way too much compared to those top teams, the other two teams. And if you look at that in terms of time on the track, that equates to about 1 second per lap. So that is obviously a huge deficit to try and overcome. And of course, they just were not able to compete with the top teams. Now, of course, there were some other issues that went on, especially at the end of the race here. Pierre Gasly, he was pretty upset with the stewards after he was dropped back, given a penalty, and that dropped him out of the top 10. And he labeled F1's penalty system as BS. I'll let you figure out what the rest of those expand on that at any rate. And so he was penalized and dropped from 10th to 13th position, and that was a result of the incident, the coming together he had with Force India's Sergio Perez at turn 17 when they were fighting over the 10th and final point paying position, and the stewards decided that he gained the position unfairly after he barged into Perez, which I thought was kind of interesting, because they've said over the last year or so that they're going to be a little bit more lenient. They're going to let some things, these racing incidents, if you want to call them that, kind of maybe slide through and try not to get these guys to maybe think too much as to, well, should I make a pass here or not? I think that's one of the things that they want to do to try and encourage drivers and encourage overtaking in Formula One. But at this point, obviously, they thought that Pierre Gasly had pushed it a little bit too far. So it's really kind of interesting to hear, like, a diverging opinion between Pierre Gasly and Fernando Alonso, who hit out at what he called "quote unquote" soft stewarding at Silverstone, and that this came after the stewards decided not to investigate an incident involving Alonso and Haas F1 driver Kevin Magnussen towards the end of the race. And at that point, Alonso was battling for Esteban Ocon for 7th position after the second safety car, and he went deep into Luffield corner and left the door a little bit open. Magnussen was able to pass, and then he pushed Alonso a little bit wide on the exit of the corner, and Alonso put one wheel off into the gravel, and Alonso attempted to fight back at Maggots on the same lap, but was cut off by Magnussen, and then he was finally able to retake the position at turn 3 on the very, very final lap number 52 of the race. Alonso felt that the stewards should have investigated. Disappointed they didn't, but he said at least he was finally able to regain that 8th position on the very final lap of the race. Now, just sticking with McLaren now, and this is a little bit of old news. And about this time last week, the news came out that Eric Boullier had resigned, which I thought was kind of interesting. Just the way that it had like that sort of that he decided to walk away. To me, I think it kind of. I really kind of wonder if he was just given the sack as a racing director at McLaren, and this was just the sort of the public manifestation of that, where he was allowed to save a little bit of face and say that he was deciding to take all the blame for all the issues that McLaren have had, and they've actually I don't think it's any stretch of the imagination to say that McLaren have regressed after some early season promise with the Renault power units, but they've gone back at least to where they were with the Honda engines last year, if not even worse off than they were. At least they're finishing races compared to a lot of DNFs that they had during the Honda engine era, or the latest Honda era at McLaren. But this year, just absolutely dire stuff. But Zach Brown, the McLaren CEO, and said that a return to the front of the grid is still several seasons away after that they've rebuilt, or they started this rebuilding process in the past week. And that of course was kicked off by Boullier resigning. But Brown believes that the whole team needs to be restructured. And I think that's interesting. I mean, he's not the first person to say that. There have been quite a few well-known names in Formula One. I think John Barnard, the designer that was also with McLaren in their glory years in the late 80s and 90s. Well, one of their periods of glory years at any rate, had said the same thing, that there was just no way to really do it simply, that the team really needed to be stripped and rebuilt. And perhaps maybe McLaren's finally realizing that, and it could take several years. I mean, look how long it took for Mercedes to really become a contender after they took over Braun Grand Prix after that miraculous and impressive year that they had in 2009. I mean, it took them several years before they were contending and pushing and winning world championships and races. I mean, Mercedes really did not become the dominant force that they were until the turbo hybrid engine era, which they invested a lot and lots of time and money into to be so prepared for the current era that we're in. And they've dominated it ever since, which is now its fifth season. But absolutely a massive task ahead for Zach Brown and McLaren, and honestly, it's sad to see them at the back of the grid, just like it is equally sad to see Williams at the back of the grid there. Sergei Sirotkin and Lance Stroll both crashing in qualifying, and you have the reserve driver Robert Kubica saying that the only good feature on the car this year is the paint scheme, which the Martini colors look absolutely fantastic ever since they've brought them on board as a sponsor. The cars looked the paint scheme's been on point. Sadly, the car has been getting worse and worse every year, and to see them at the back of the grid starting from the pit lane, I mean, obviously we knew that Brendan Hartley was going to start from the pit lane in his Toro Rosso. Obviously he had that big scary shunt in free practice, kept him out of qualifying on Saturday, and then they had to really rush to try to get the car going and put back together. They were still trying to bolt pieces on as the teams were lining up and getting the cars ready to start the formation lap, and he only did a couple of laps before retiring the car. But he was the third, the two other cars in front of him starting from the pit lane, both Williams. Absolutely sad. I think Sirotkin is just, I don't think he's cut out for Formula One, and they need a guy. I think they really do need an experienced driver to really help them to develop the car. I mean, the aero package that they have for this year, it's completely different than what they've had in the past couple of years, but they've completely missed the mark. The aero package is just not good enough. And Lance Stroll is an interesting one. I've been kind of critical about him, but he did have that P3 in Azerbaijan last year. I mean, we've seen from time to time, we've seen some good moments from Lance. So where does that leave us with Lance Stroll and Sergei Sirotkin? Good question, but there is no doubt that the car itself is just it's a complete lemon, it's a complete dog, and who knows, maybe even a bona fide driver that we know might not be able to do much more with it. So perhaps we have to temper our criticism of Lance Stroll and Sergei Sirotkin just in the fact that we know that FW41 is just a terrible car. All right, well, it's time to start wrapping this one up, and just before I do. There are just a couple more points to touch on. And here in Canada, the Montreal, the home of the Canadian Grand Prix at Circuit Gilles Villeneuve on Ile Notre Dame in the St. Lawrence Seaway, as they've started the demolition of the existing pit lane facilities, so that they were all demolished last week as they start construction for the new pit complex, which should be ready for next year's Canadian Grand Prix, which usually goes the beginning of June. That's what the traditional, or what's become the traditional date for the Canadian Grand Prix over the past several years. And the old podium on which the likes of Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost, Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, and more have celebrated race wins is gone. But there's a new and more advanced and up-to-date pit facilities, and the buildings and that pit lane that was moved to the current location in 1988. So it's been there for a very long time. So it's long overdue. So the race organizers were in discussions with Bernie Ecclestone to keep the race in Montreal until 2029, and that was finally agreed to. And the rebuilding and that plan was all agreed as part of this deal. So there is a bit of, I guess, a race to get the construction well and truly underway and up and running before the winter sets in Montreal. But come on, the Canadian construction industry is pretty strong, and I'm pretty sure that they have a very competent construction group and management team in place to get this done, so that the pit facilities will be completed and ready to go for the 2019 Canadian Grand Prix at the beginning of next summer. And finally, the last piece of news has to do with Haas F1 junior racer Santino Ferrucci, who has been banned from the next 4 Formula 2 races. And this comes after the American youngster deliberately drove into his teammate Arjen Maini at the end of the F2 race at Silverstone this past weekend. And Ferrucci and his father were accused of unsportsmanlike and uncivilized conduct by his own F2 team, Trident. So Haas F1 have not said anything more other than that they're waiting to gather all the pertinent information. And Gunther Steiner, the team boss at Haas F1, has only arrived back at the team's headquarters in the United States after the British Grand Prix on Sunday. So we'll have to wait and see how that all plays out over the next couple of days. But Ferrucci obviously overstepping things, and judging by the outrage on Twitter, there are not very many Santino Ferrucci fans, and a lot of people looking or calling for him to be let go by Haas. And well, we were talking at the beginning of the race, the beginning of the show, all about Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton and Kimi Räikkönen and Valtteri Bottas and all the comings together that we've seen with these guys over the past couple of races. But Ferrucci definitely taking that to a different level, and it was pretty obvious from everything that I've heard. I haven't seen it myself, but at least everything I've seen in that little quote that I read came from Nate Saunders, the associate F1 editor at ESPN UK. So we'll wait and see what comes out of that. Anyways, it's time to wrap this one up and dim the lights here in my studio. Before I go, I just want to give a shout out to the new Twitter followers for the show, and that our Twitter handle is at Scuderia F1 Pod. And a big shout out to Shimikawa Naoko, F1 Stats, Oana Papuyu, Gav, and Gatsby. So thank you all very much for the follows. Give me a follow here on Twitter, and I'll give you a follow back. Love talking about Formula One, talking about motorsports, and, well, basically whatever's on your mind. So give me a follow, send me a tweet. Love to get in touch and talk with other Formula One fans around the world. And of course, if you could always also do us a solid and leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download and listen to this show, it would be much appreciated. World Cup final goes this weekend. Don't know who that's going to be, but once that's over, that means my friend and co-host Kevin Laramée will finally be back from World Cup duty. And I'm looking forward to Kevin coming back because, guys, honestly, as much as I love doing this, it's a lot of work to research the show, put together all the show notes, produce this thing. do all the post-editing and the post-production and sit here and talk for 30 to 45 minutes without the benefit of bouncing different topics off of my co-host and trying to pull out all sort of pertinent information and facts. And that reminds me, just before I do go, just wanted to quickly bring you all up to date on the Drivers' Championship. Top 5 drivers are in order: Sebastian Vettel, 171 points; Lewis Hamilton in second, 163 points, followed by Kimi Räikkönen with 116, Danny Ricciardo with 106, and Valtteri Bottas rounding out the top 5 drivers in the World Championship with 104 points. Constructors Championship, Ferrari leading the way with 287 points, 20 points ahead with Mercedes with 267. Red Bull Racing making a better year of it so far with 199 points. Renault with 70 points in 4th position, and Haas with 51 in the 5th place in the Constructors Championship. Anyways, that's it. Time for me to wrap this one up. Thank you all very much for listening to the podcast this week. We'll catch you again soon. And until next time, have a great week. And I'll be back and talking to you again very soon, I guess. That's it, guys. Have a great week. I'm out of here.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.